ever read the title of an article and wondered, why would you do that? Now, because that article involves reconstructing the autopsy of an empress, this video has been brought to you by pure self-indulgence. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, called Sissi by her family, is the sort of historical figure who's become very romanticized in popular culture, in movies and shows and cartoons. But her life was a lot more complicated than what those pieces of media might show you. She was born in Munich on December 24th, 1837, and she was a member of the Wittelsbach family. The Wittelsbach family ruled Bavaria, but Elizabeth's father, Maximilian, was part of the ducal branch of the family. This meant that they didn't really have a lot of official responsibilities, they weren't actually ruling. So Duke Maximilian and his wife, Elizabeth's mother, Duchess Ludwig, raised their children in Possenhofen in Bavaria, instead of around the royal court in Munich. As the family grew, Duchess Ludwig schemed with her sister, Archduchess Sophie, to arrange marriages among members of their families. To understand events that happened later in Elizabeth's life, we need to take a moment to talk about Archduchess Sophie. Archduchess Sophie had married into the Habsburg family, the dynasty that ruled the Austrian Empire. Sophie convinced her husband, Archduke Franz Karl, to give up his place as the heir to the throne. This meant that when Franz Karl's brother, Emperor Ferdinand, abdicated, he gave up the throne. The throne passed to Sophie and Franz Karl's son, Franz Joseph. So Sophie gave up her chance at being empress in order to be more of a power behind the throne sort of figure. This ambition and controlling behavior would later cause issues for Elizabeth, but first, Sophie started scheming to find her son, now Emperor Franz Joseph, a wife. Franz Joseph had already fallen in love with the princess, Anna of Prussia, but she was already engaged, so that wasn't going to work. Sophie recruited her sister, Duchess Ludwig, into her scheme, and Ludwig conveniently had multiple daughters, including Elizabeth. However, Elizabeth was only about 15 years old at the time, so Sophie and Ludwig had already picked Elizabeth's older sister Helene to be Franz Joseph's intended wife. But they all got together at an imperial summer resort so that Franz Joseph could meet Helene and propose to her. This did not go according to plan as a result of Franz Joseph's tendency to fall in love easily, which frankly is kind of a red flag. He met Elizabeth and decided he wanted to marry her instead. They got married in Vienna on April 24th, 1854, making Elizabeth the Empress of Austria. Life as empress wasn't easy for Elizabeth. She was shy and would refuse to make the kind of public appearances that the Viennese aristocracy expected of her. They expected to see her and have access to her, but she denied them that, which made her unpopular at court. Instead, her private visits to orphanages, asylums, poorhouses, and hospitals made her popular with the general public. These private visits weren't considered appropriate behavior for an empress by the aristocracy. Elizabeth would always be more comfortable in Bavaria than in Vienna, so moving to Vienna made her very homesick. On top of all of this, her marriage to Franz Joseph had some problems. His affairs didn't help, but thanks to her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, being very controlling, Elizabeth was not allowed to be alone with Franz Joseph. When Elizabeth and Franz Joseph started having children, Sophie had already decided to separate Elizabeth from her first baby before the baby was even born. Elizabeth wouldn't be very involved in the lives of her children, and unfortunately she would outlive 2 of her 4 children. Elizabeth would find power in and agency over her physical appearance, and I think this is one of the reasons that her life has become so romanticized in modern media. She was regarded as incredibly beautiful, and other people decided that other beautiful empresses of the time, including her husband's sister-in-law, Empress Charlotte of Mexico, and Eugenie, Empress of the French, were her rivals, regardless of however these women actually got along with each other. In order to maintain her appearance, Elizabeth would do starvation diets, she would exercise a lot, and she developed very elaborate skin and hair care routines. At a certain point in her life, she would refuse to be photographed as she grew older. It's hard to avoid images of the youthful Empress Elizabeth and her long, luxurious hair in Vienna, or at least that's how it felt when I visited the city several years ago, which is odd because she spent as much time as she could anywhere that wasn't Vienna. Elizabeth traveled throughout Europe, writing poetry, spending a ton of money on horses, and hanging out with her cousin, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was the guy who built Neuschwanstein Castle. It was all of this traveling that brought Elizabeth and her lady-in-waiting, Irma, to Geneva in 1898. On this trip, Elizabeth had been traveling under a false name, Countess von Hohenels, in order to avoid attention. Unfortunately, someone leaked her identity and the name of the hotel where she was staying to a local newspaper, and the newspaper published that information. A young anarchist named Luigi Lucchini happened to read that newspaper. Luigi had given himself a mission to assassinate an aristocrat, but his original target, Prince Henri of Orleans, had already left Geneva. Upon reading that newspaper, Luigi decided Elizabeth would be a suitable target instead. On September 10th, 1898, Elizabeth and her lady-in-waiting Irma were on their way to board a boat for an excursion. Armed with a sharpened file, Luigi approached Elizabeth, stabbed her in the chest, and ran away. It happened so fast that Elizabeth didn't actually realize what had happened, turning to Irma and asking, "What do you think that man wanted from me? Maybe my watch?" With nothing obviously wrong, the two women boarded the boat. Elizabeth started to feel dizzy, becoming pale over a few minutes until she lost consciousness and collapsed. A small, coin-sized bloodstain was found on her clothes. Someone informed the boat's captain about what was happening, and then he ordered the boat returned to the port. Elizabeth regained consciousness long enough to ask, "What actually did happen to me?" before passing out again. She was taken to a nearby hotel and attended by doctors, but she never regained consciousness again. Empress Elisabeth was pronounced dead at 2:10 p.m. Partial autopsy took place the next day. The documents regarding this autopsy are held in the Austrian State Archives, including the order for the postmortem examination, the description of the external inspection of Elizabeth's body, and the autopsy report. Elizabeth had been stabbed 11 centimeters to the left of her sternum, that's the bone that's about in the center of your chest, and 11 centimeters below her left clavicle. Her fourth rib was fractured by the impact that came with that stab wound. The autopsy found a blood clot in the pericardium from the perforation of the heart's left ventricular wall. The pericardium is a fluid-filled sac that protects the heart and helps it function. The cause of Elizabeth's death was determined to have been pericardial tamponade as a result of the wounds from being stabbed. So, what is pericardial or cardiac tamponade? It's a condition in which too much blood or other fluid fills the heart or the pericardium. This increases pressure on the heart and prevents its chambers from filling with blood properly. Then, the heart won't be able to pump blood, leading to a drop in blood pressure. Ultimately, this means that blood and oxygen can't make it to the rest of the body. Symptoms include heart palpitations, shortness of breath or trouble breathing, chest pain and fainting, dizziness or lightheadedness. A lot of different things can cause cardiac tamponade, including blunt trauma, heart attacks, and penetrating trauma like a stab wound. Could Elizabeth have survived this injury? The authors Meyer et al. Argue that on a purely theoretical basis, Elizabeth could have been saved. To understand why they made this argument, let's look at the history of treating heart wounds as it relates to cardiac tamponade. Until the Renaissance, heart wounds were generally thought to be fatal, understandably. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, we start to see more written descriptions of heart wounds, including more descriptions of different symptoms and how to diagnose them. In 1810, Dominique Loret, a surgeon of Napoleon, performed the first open drainage of the pericardium on a soldier. There's another Napoleon cameo. Unfortunately, the soldier later died from pericarditis, the inflammation of the pericardium, so I don't know if we can really call this procedure a complete success. Also, a Spanish physician called Romero might have done this procedure first in 1801, but the exact date of this operation is unknown, so he doesn't get as much credit. These procedures did get better as medical knowledge improved and surgery became safer. A German surgeon, Edmund Rose, created the term cardiac tamponade or tamponade of the heart in 1884. In 1896, only 2 years before Elizabeth's death, Ludwig completed the first successful treatment of cardiac tamponade by using silk sutures to stitch up a pericardial laceration. Based on the history of heart wounds and cardiac tamponade, the authors Meyer et al. Argue that contemporary medical knowledge would have been enough to save Elizabeth. But we know that's not how things happened. So why weren't Elizabeth's doctors able to save her? Elizabeth didn't receive medical attention in time. The attack happened so fast she didn't even realize that she'd been stabbed, and the symptoms of cardiac tamponade were delayed. To better explore this and the reason for the delay in the onset of her symptoms, Elizabeth's autopsy was reconstructed. Let's consider the assassin Luigi's weapon first. He used a 10-centimeter long sharpened file, and the stab wound found during the autopsy measured 8.5 centimeters. It's the shaft of the file that hit Elizabeth's fourth rib and fractured it. However, there isn't a lot of literature out there about what happens when a person is stabbed in the heart with this kind of weapon, because sharpened files aren't used for this activity very often. The only thing that comes close is a rare example of the use of a screwdriver. The physical reconstruction of Elizabeth's autopsy used a thin blade in a cadaver to recreate the stab wound. The file pierced Elizabeth's lung and her heart in two places, a bit like an entrance and exit wound in the heart. This is referred to with the fancy terms double perforation of the left ventricle, the left and right ventricles being two of the heart's chambers. Blood leaked out of these two perforations and into the pericardium. But the wounds from such a thin blade were narrow, meaning that this leaking happened very slowly. That gave Elizabeth enough time to board the boat for her planned excursion before any symptoms started affecting her and she eventually lost consciousness and her heart stopped. Luigi Lucchesi didn't get away with this crime. He was arrested and he would later die in prison. Emperor Franz Joseph, who would live until 1916, created the Imperial Austrian Order of Elizabeth in honor of his wife after her assassination. This would be awarded to women for charitable works, regardless of their social status. However, this order was abolished in 1918 when the Habsburg monarchy was deposed and the empire ceased to exist. Elizabeth lives on in various works of fiction, including books, TV shows, and movies. Austrian Airlines even put the cartoon version of Elizabeth on an airplane. I could not find this through Google Images and had to go make sure that I did not hallucinate it. That's not even the only cartoon about her, and there are playlists of episodes of both cartoons on YouTube. In 1996, Elizabeth was even recreated as a limited edition Barbie. In Vienna, you can visit the Sissi Museum, where items and clothes that belong to her are on display. The weapon with which she was assassinated is on display at the Josephinum, a medical museum in Vienna. Elizabeth herself is buried in the imperial crypt of the Church of the Capuchin Friars in Vienna. If you're interested in reading more about Empress Elisabeth, I highly recommend The Reluctant Empress by Brigitte Hamann. What I really enjoy about this book is how much information it provides about the geopolitical context in which Elizabeth lived. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. I made Elizabeth out of yarn because I have no self-control.